I'm reading from The American Republic and Human Liberty, Foreshadowed in Scripture by George Searle, 1815 to 1889. It's an old book. Chapter 7. The American Republic established by the direct interposition of God. The quote-unquote fifth power pointed out by the prophet being the United States. It was to be set up by God, quote, "And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom," end quote. Daniel 2nd 44. 1. God's disapproval of monarchies. God has shown his positive disapprobation approbation of the monarchical forms of government. When Israel asked to have a king like the heathen nations around them, God said to Samuel, quote, "Protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them," end quote. 1 Samuel 8:9. 2. God never plants monarchies. Such being the dim estimate of monarchy, it is reasonable to infer that God never plants monarchies. He may permit them to rise just as he allowed Israel a king with his protest. Quote, "I gave them a king in mine anger," end quote. Hosea, I think it's 13:11. In the divine language touching this matter, now if it shall appear from the facts of history that the United States was set up by God, then it is the fifth power, as God does not plant monarchies, and no republic except the United States existed between the time of the uttering of the prophecy and the time of the rise of the fifth power. 3. God proceeded upon the same plan in establishing the Republic of the United States that he did in the planting the Hebrew Commonwealth. As the first republic, that of the ancient Hebrews, was established by Jehovah and was designed as a type of our own, it is not unreasonable to suppose that the means used by the great architect in building the first temple of liberty would resemble those used in the erection of the second. But what was the divine mode of procedure in the first instance? On this subject we have positive and direct information in Deuteronomy 4, 32, 34, quote, "For ask now of the days of that are past, which were before thee since the day that God created man upon the earth, and ask from one side of heaven unto the other, whether there have been any such thing as this great thing is, or have been heard like it," end quote. This important question was asked relative to the Hebrew Republic, which had no prototype. Other forms of government had existed, but nothing like this had been heard of. This interrogatory refers to the manner of the establishment as well as the nature of the government, which later is expressed in the verses which follow, quote, "Did ever people hear the voice of God speaking out of the midst of the fire as thou hast heard and lived? Or hath God essayed to go and take him a nation from the midst of another nation by temptations, by signs, and by wonders, and by war, and by a mighty hand, and by a stretched out arm, and by great terrors, according to all that the Lord your God did for you before your eyes," end quote. Here are 7 particulars enumerated used by God in planting that nation. They are, quote, "temptations, signs, wonders, war, a mighty hand, a stretched out arm, and great terrors," end quote. This is almost a perfect description of the means which God used in establishing the United States. Who does not know that we came into existence as a nation through, quote, "temptations and signs and wonders and war and great terrors, by a mighty hand and a stretched out arm," end quote. 1. The material out of which the nation was built was prepared, as was that of Israel in the fiery furnace of trial. This work of preparation continued through successive generations. It commenced far back in the past, and was carried forward by the Infinite One, till the fullness of the time had come when a mighty nation was born. Long had the cruel taskmasters of despotism oppressed and persecuted even unto death the friends of civil and religious liberty. But like Israel and Egypt, they only increased the more, while God overruled their trials for their own development and the good of the world. Little did these suffering ones know of the good they were working out for mankind in developing those God-given ideas of the equality and dignity of human nature. It is a wise feature in the divine economy which perpetuates the truth a man may have brought to light after he has passed away. Truth, like its divine author, is imperishable, eternal. It dies not when we die, but is left by us as a heritage to posterity. It is in the power of every man so to live through life that this noble deeds, when he shall have ceased to be, we still live on as moral forces in the world, and associated with his name, shall make that name to coming generations as, quote, ointment poured forth, end quote. Such were the men by whom and through whom the great ideas of liberty were developed, from generation to generation. Quote, Brewster and Withrop and Roger Williams and Penn and George Calvert and Oglethorpe and Otis and Adams and Jefferson and Washington, with their illustrious co-laborers, could trace their political percentage to Pym, and Hampton and Wycliffe and Milton and Cromwell, and to the ages in which they vindicated the principles of liberty, and sealed many of them their faith by martyrdom. End quote. To the place for the nation's planting was providentially prepared. Quote, the principles that govern human affairs, end quote, says Bancroft, quote, extending like a path of light from century to century, become the highest demonstration of the superintending providence of God. Universal history does but seek to relate the sum of all God's works of providence. The wheels of providence are not turned about by blind chance, but they are full of eyes round about, and they are all guided by the Spirit of God. Providence is the light of history and the soul of the world. God is in history, and all history has a unity because God is in it. End quote. On no page of the world's history is the right hand of God more clearly seen than on that which records the events connected with the discovery of this continent and its preparation for the planting of a great free nation. Irving, in speaking of Columbus, says, quote, Columbus came as a religious man and admiral of Christ to find the continent not for its material treasures, but because it held souls which he wished to bring as a trophy to the feet of Christ. End quote. A deep religious feeling mingled with its meditations, that he looked upon himself as being in the hand of heaven, chosen from among men for the accomplishment of its high purpose. It is very remarkable that Columbus believed that his contemplated discoveries were foretold in the, quote, mystic revelations of the prophets, end quote. Quote, the ends of the earth were to be brought together, and all nations and tongues and languages united under the banner of the Redeemer, end quote. Quote, this he believed was to be the triumphant consummation of his enterprise, bringing the unknown regions of the earth into communion with Christian Europe, end quote. Every new discovery which he made was celebrated with devout and humble thanks to Almighty God, as his ship neared the shores of the New World, where there went up from its deck the voice of prayer and praise, and the moment he leaped onto the soil, he prostrated himself in thanksgiving to God. More than 100 years passed after the discoveries by Spain and England before any very successful attempt was made to colonize the country. This century was one of the most eventful in the history of the world. Quote, the 12 decades, end quote, says an able writer, quote, from 1480 to 1600 form one of the grandest and richest eras in the history of humanity, end quote. It was in that period that liberty was planted. While this great work was going on in Europe, the New World was held in reserve that it might be planted with liberty. 8. God safely conducted our fathers from the Old to the New World. Never was the divine presence more clearly seen in conducting the people of Israel from Egypt to Canaan across the Red Sea than in bringing our fathers across a boisterous ocean to the place of their planting. On their voyage, they observed the days of fasting and prayer. Their answers to prayer are said to have been remarkable. They astonished the sailors, calling forth from them expressions of wonder and amazement. December 22nd, 1620, was the commencement of a new era in the world's history. The landing on that memorable day of 101 pilgrims on Plymouth Rock was a most portentous event. In that noble band of brothers there dwelt a generative truth which was destined under God to shake empires and thrones to their fall, and sweep them into oblivion as the chaff is borne away by the winds of heaven. Who can contemplate that event without the heart going up to the great Father of us all, in grateful acknowledgments for his manifested goodness to the children of men? The divine interposition in the revolutionary struggle was manifested in raising up and qualifying those who were to be the principal actors in the scene. It is a feature of the divine economy that whenever a great work is to be done, the instrument is raised up and fully fitted for its accomplishment. History gives us numerous and striking illustrations of the truth of this principle. When a new world was to be discovered, a Columbus was raised up. When it became necessary that the church and the world should be lifted out of the tomb of the Dark Ages, the fountain of life unsealed, and the seed of the American Revolution and American independence sown, the voice of the immortal Luther was heard. When the lights lit up by the Reformation were burning dimly, and Christianity seemed to be waning through the whole of Europe, when the times seemed to demand a higher style of Christian life and society in both the old and new worlds, needed a new element of Christian life in order to complete the temple of liberty, that man of God, John Wesley, appeared, and under God inaugurated one of the mightiest revivals of pure religion and that has ever blessed our world, and which the great Chalmers was pleased truthfully to denominate. This is, quote, Christianity in earnest, end quote. So too, when the work of preparation was finished, and the birth time of a great republic drew near, and one was needed to guide the hosts of freedom through the fiery tempest of war, God gave the world a Washington. But few men are distinguished far more than a single trait of superiority. Alexander conquered the world, but could not govern himself. Napoleon was unsurpassed in military tactics, but in this alone he excelled his compeers. Homer, as a poet, was distinguished for his beauty, Virgil for his sublimity, and Milton for his invention. Mozart was distinguished, but it was only for his powers of music. Aristotle for his metaphysical subtleties, and Newton for his powers of analysis. There are a few, however, who seem to possess a kind of universal genius, men who have made attainments varied and rare. These are the representatives of men of the ages, the, quote, lights and landmarks of the cliffs of fame, end quote. In this list, stretching as it does all along down the line of time, from the early morning of our world to the present, are recorded the imperishable names of history. It is the record of God's noblemen. Here is found the name of the father of the faithful, Abraham, of the Hebrew statesman and president of the world's first republic, Moses, of the statesmen of Chaldea and prophet of God, Daniel, of the apostle of the Gentiles, Paul, and the names of the Luthers and Calvins and Cromwells and Wesleys. In this list of earth's greatest ones is chronicled the name of George Washington. It is only once in a while that God opens the hand of his beneficence and gives the world a Washington. And yet whenever a Washington is needed, he is giver. Washington, quote, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen, end quote. In contemplating his character, military chieftain, though he was, we are not brought to witness the bloody hero, returning from the battlefield, reeking with the blood of slaughtered thousands, but to the contemplation of a single character in whom centered and around whom clustered all things higher, all those higher and purer virtues which adorn and beautify human character, and constitute the highest state of man. The name of Washington has in it a power which is felt to the ends of the earth, and which shall continue till the last throne despotism shall have fallen, and the Republic of America become the Republic of the world. It is a suggestive fact that George Washington, who led forth the embattled hosts of freedom to victory and liberty, and who was president of the convention which formed the old Articles of Confederation, and of the convention which formed the Constitution, and the first president of the nation, which a devout Christian and a member of the Church of God. Quote, I have heard much of his religious character, end quote, writes a chaplain of the Revolution immediately after his appointment by Congress, quote, and hence looked with a great deal of anxiety for his first orator to see if there was anything more than a mere formal recognition of the Supreme Being. Today he issued it, and it was with a heart overflowing to God with gratitude that I read the following passage in it. The General most earnestly requires and expects the due observance of those Articles of War established for the government of the army, which forbid cursing, swearing, and drunkenness, and in like manner he requires and expects of all officers and soldiers not engaged on actual duties a punctual attendance on divine service, to implore the blessings of heaven upon the means used for safety and defense. End quote. He was often found engaged in earnest prayer for guidance and success. Dr. Edward Thompson has somewhere said of Washington, quote, that he fought the American Revolution through on his knees. End quote. It is said that at early morning on that ever memorable day of the Battle of Yorktown, a member of the Society of Friends was heard to say that Americans will achieve a great victory today, and when asked the reason said, quote, I saw Washington at dawn of day in the forest, earnestly engaged in prayer, end quote. On one occasion, Isaac Potts, whose house was Washington's headquarters at Valley Forge, discovered Washington in a retired place pouring out his soul in prayer to God. Potts went to his wife and said, quote, if there is one man on this earth to whom the Lord will listen, it is George Washington, end quote. Washington was a man of strong faith in God. Herein was the secret of his success. Quote, I truly believe, he said he, in a dark hour of the Revolution, says, quote, God is with us, and though the way may be dark and dreary, I believe he will carry us through safety, end quote. Faith gives power to the human will. He who would be great in action must will to perform, but in order to will, he must believe the accomplishment possible. It may be laid down as a correct rule that the degree of the strength of our faith in God constitutes the measure of our power to plan and execute the great purposes of life. Washington seems to have been under the special protection of heaven during the entire struggle for liberty. The Indian at Fort Pitt, after aiming his deadly rifle and firing 17 times at Washington, taking deliberate aim each time, gave up in despair and gave it as his opinion that the youthful commander was under the special protection of the Great Spirit. This opinion of the savage was undoubtedly correct. God, who sees the end from the beginning, had a great work in reserve for Washington, and by the shield of his protection, he rendered him immortal till his work was done. The conjurators of the immortal Washington were men of rare qualities. Never before did the world produce in any single age so many men of superior ability. The Temple of Liberty was not to be reared by entered apprentices, but by master builders. James Otis, who was among the first champions of freedom and who lifted his voice against the tyranny of the British government as early as 1761, was educated under Christian influence by a pious clergyman. In that Christian school, we learn to love liberty and hate despotism. This is quote-unquote Otis. Said John Adams, quote, is a flame of fire, with a promptitude of classical allusions, a depth of research, a rapid summary, of historical events and dates, a profusion of legal authorities, a prophetic glance of his eyes into futurity, and a rapid torrent of impetuous eloquence. He hurried all before him. End quote. The speech referred to here is the one made in Boston on port duties, alluded to before. It is said that Adams, who was young at the time, heard the speech, and the impressions received was never lost. Quote unquote, American independence, says Adams, quote, was then and there born the seeds of patriots and heroes to defend a vigorous youth, were there and then sown. In 15 years, that is, in 1776, he grew up to manhood and declared himself free. End quote. Quote, there can be, end quote, said Otis, quote, no prescriptions old enough to supersede the law of nature and the grant of Almighty God, who has given all man a right to be free, the right of every man to his life, his liberty, no created being can rightly contest. God made all men naturally equal. End quote. Joseph Warren, who fell at Bunker Hill in 1775 in the very commencement of the Revolutionary struggle, was a graduate of Cambridge University, a ripe scholar and eloquent orator, and possessed of rare military ability. Spears tells us there was hardly anyone whose example exercised a more inspiring and elevating influence upon his countrymen and the world than that of the brave, blooming, generous, and self-devoted martyr of Bunker Hill. Such a character is the noblest spectacle which the world affords. The friends of liberty from all countries and throughout all time, as they kneel upon the spot that was moistened by the blood of Warren, will find their better feelings strengthened by the influence of the place, and will gather from it a virtue in some degree allied to his own. End quote. Warren offered his life a most willing sacrifice on the altar of freedom. On the morning of the battle he said to a friend, quote, I know I may fall, but where is the man who does not think it glorious and beautiful to die for his country? End quote. Noble patriot, thy name is embalmed in the hearts of a nation. We will not forget thee. We will grow better while we contemplate those noble deeds which have wrested thy name from the oblivious power of death and rendered imperishable. Samuel Adams was a devoted Christian, a most exemplary member of the church. In his house was an altar from which there ascended to God, evening and morning, sacrifices and thanksgiving and praise. No patriot of the Revolution stood higher than Samuel Adams. The ink of his signature of the Declaration of Independence was hardly dry, when from the steps of the State House in Philadelphia he thrilled and moved the gathered thousands of patriots with his eloquence. John Adams, the orator of the Revolution, signer of the Declaration of Independence, the first vice president and the second president of the American Republic, was a scholar of rare acquirements, a devout Christian, and a member of the Christian Church. Patrick Henry, that man whose eloquence, like the tempest, swept all before it, that moved the friends of liberty to a speedy resistance to British tyranny, was a firm believer in the doctrines and truths of the Christian religion. His biographer, Ritt, tells us that he was a sincere Christian. His favorite works were Doddridge's Rise and Progress of Religion and the Soul, Butler's Analogy of Religion, Natural and Revealed, and Jennings' views of the internal evidences of the Christian religion. He estimated the Bible above all other books. Quote unquote, here, said to a friend holding up the Bible, quote, is a book worth more than all other books ever printed, end quote. John Hancock, the President of Congress in 1776, another patriot who first signed the Covenant of Life, the Declaration of Independence, was the son of a Christian minister of the states of Massachusetts and himself a most consistent Christian. Early in the struggle for liberty he thus speaks, quote, I have the most animating confidence that the present noble struggle for liberty will terminate gloriously for America. And let us play the man for our God and for the cities of our God while we are using the means in our power. Let us humbly commit our righteous cause to the great God of the universe, who loveth righteousness and hateth iniquity, end quote. Thomas Jefferson, the father of the Declaration of Independence, has been charged with being an unbeliever in the Holy Scriptures. Never was a charge more unjust. Quote unquote, he, says one who wrote understandingly upon the subject, quote, believed in God, the creator of all things, in his overruling providence, infinite wisdom, goodness, justice, and mercy. He believed that God hears and answers prayers, and that human trust in him is never misplaced nor disregarded. He believed in future rewards and punishments. He believed in the truth of the Bible and gave largely to the Bible cause and to the erection of churches, end quote. The following Christian sentiment is found in his first message as President of the United States. Quote, I shall need the favor of that being in whose hands we are, who led our fathers as Israel of old from their native land and planted them in a country flowing with all the necessaries and comforts of life, who has covered our infancy with his providence and our ripper years with his wisdom and power, and to whose goodness I ask you to join with me in supplications that he will so enlighten the minds of your servants, guide their counsels, and prosper their measures, end quote. Quote, can the liberties of a nation, quote, said he, quote, be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of these people that their liberties are the gifts of God, that they are not violated except by his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever, end quote. In 1818, Mr. Jefferson wrote a letter of condolence to John Adams on the occasion of the death of his wife, in which he expresses a hope of soon meeting his departed friends, whom he shall still love, and from whom he shall never be separated. He closes his letter thus, quote, God bless you and support you under your heavy afflictions, end quote. In all of his early state papers of importance, in all of his early state papers of importance, such as a summary review of British America, his portion of the declaration made by Congress on the cause of taking up arms, the draft of the Constitution for Virginia, the Declaration of Independence, and his inaugural addresses, there is a clear and pointed recognition of God and his providence. The last years of Mr. Jefferson's life were occupied in establishing the University of Virginia, which he desired should rival the universities of Oxford and Cambridge in England. He included in his plan the establishment of a theological department in which all religious denominations might be represented. We are inclined to believe that this charge of atheism against Mr. Jefferson has grown out of a hatred to the Declaration of Independence. If, as Dr. Smith of South Carolina says, the Declaration of Independence is an, quote, atheistic doctrine, end quote, then was its author, Thomas Jefferson, an atheist. Dr. Franklin, that wise philosopher and able statesman, was reared under Christian influence. In early life, he read a small work entitled, quote, Essays to Do Good, end quote, from the pen of Dr. Matthews. In advanced life, he acknowledged that if he had done any good for his country or his fellow men, he owed it to the impressions received from this book in his early youth. His life was an exemplification of the principles of religion. This list might be extended to a much greater length did space permit. We have given these a sample of the whole. They were God's chosen instruments, and as such they were, quote, able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and known among the people, end quote. But we are not to suppose that the fair temple of liberty was reared without the polishing hand of woman. The records of history from the earliest to the latest times testify to the efficiency of women's influence in molding and polishing the institutions of civil liberty society. She who with her own hands gathered acacias and rushes from the banks of the ancient Nile and constructed an ark of safety for the emancipator and the president of the world's first republic in his hours of helpless infancy, has been made a powerful agent in the destruction of oppression. The edifices of human society would present but a rough exterior were it not for the polishing hand of woman. Her influence during the rearing of the Temple of American Liberty was incalculable. It was under woman's molding influence that America's great statesmen were developed. She was a prominent actor in preparing the broad basis of intelligence on which the superstructure of liberty was built. During the revolutionary struggle, they contributed to the cause of liberty by their earnest prayers, their godly example, their great self-denial, and their pure patriotism. Miss Elliot remarks, quote, I have been struck by the fact that almost all were noted for piety. The spirit that exhibited itself in acts of humanity, courage, patriotism, and magnanimity was deeply a religious one. May we not with reason deem this an important source of the strength that gave success to the American cause? To inflame the fires of freedom by mutual interchanges of feelings and to keep them burning in the hearts of all around, they formed freedom associations and entered into written pledges to make every sacrifice they could for their country. End quote. When the high duty was imposed on 300 heads of families in Boston were entered into a written covenant, quote, that they would totally abstain from tea till the revenue acts were repealed, end quote. This example of the matrons was followed by their daughters, who thus resolved, quote, we the daughters of those patriots who have and do now appear for the public interest and to principally regard their posterity as such, do with pleasure engage with them in denying ourselves the drinking of foreign tea in hopes to frustrate a plan which tends to deprive a whole community of all that is valuable in life. Boston, February 12, 1770. An association called the Daughters of Liberty was formed in Boston. 50 of its members met once a day at the house of a friend and spun 232 skeins of yarn. Many of the sons of liberty came among them and received fresh inspiration in the cause of freedom. Liberty songs of the most stirring character were sung by all, and the meeting closed with new resolves and purposes to battle for their right. The young ladies of Mecklenburg and Rowan, North Carolina, entered into a written pledge not to receive the attentions of young men who would not volunteer in defense of their country. They declared that they, quote, were of the opinion that such persons who stay loitering at home when the important cause of their country demanded their military service abroad must certainly be destitute of that boldness of sentiment, that brave and manly spirit which would qualify them to be the defenders and guardians of the fair sex, end quote. Then, as in the present struggle, needful articles of clothing were prepared by the fair hand of woman for the faithful soldier. When Lafayette in 1776, in passing through Baltimore, was given a public reception, he was observed to be sad. Quote, why so sad? End quote, said a gay young lady. Quote, I can not enjoy these festivities, quote, said Lafayette. Says, quote, while so many of the poor soldiers are without sheets and without necessaries, end quote. Quote, they shall be supplied, end quote, responded the patriotic ladies of Baltimore. They immediately began the work and ceased not till the soldiers were relieved. A British officer once remarked to Miss Pinckney, the wife of Charles Pinckney, an orator of the Revolution of great fame, quote, it is impossible not to admire the intrepid firmness of the ladies of your country. Had your men but half the resolution, we might give up the contest. America would be free, end quote.